Hello, Barbara. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
No, thank you. And so I want to give you a little insight on my process on how I reach out to creatives to be on the podcast. I simply run through Instagram, and it literally only takes me 5 to 10 seconds for me to download and react to the visuals onto Instagram's page. As people who appreciate art, I think we're able to know fairly quickly if someone's work evokes emotion. Today's guest is Barbara Johansen Newman, and I glanced at her amazing art and I knew instantaneously that she was special. It's not a surprise after further digging that she has a rich history of doing illustrations for magazines, newspapers, books, and corporate clients. And before we start, Barbara, where can people see your work?
The best place is on Instagram. I think I'm most current with that, although when I do finish a new piece and get it photographed well, I'll put it up on my website. So, online. And I have a Facebook page as well. So when I post on Instagram, it goes immediately also to my professional Facebook page.
Great. And listeners, connect with her through her social media site. And my first question, Barbara, is I love your personal art and the style in which you paint your subjects.
Thank you.
I know you have a rich history of being a creative. Please tell us about your background.
Well, I think that in my family, came from artists, and I came from a creative atmosphere, and so people were always drawing or making, and so that just seemed like a natural thing to do, a passion. At some point in high school, I was on the typical college track, and I said, "Nah, I think I'm just going to take some art courses instead," and I did. And I ended up going to private college for a year to apply to get in. And it was a disappointment to me because it was very conceptual. Conceptual art was very in. And I really just wanted to draw and paint. And so I left it after a year and I went to my local community college. I went home and I went to a local community college, Rockland Community College, which is about 40 miles north of the city, New York City. And I just took 5 art courses and tried to figure out what to do next. And I was in heaven because I was drawing, I was painting, I was sculpting. I was just doing what I wanted to do. It's do printmaking, and it was just pure pleasure. And eventually, I also got at that year from the head of the department the best advice I've ever had from the head. He said to me, he said, "Barbara, work from your head." And so I pretty much have done that throughout my artistic career. Anyway, fast forward, it was time to transfer. I was going to go to Parsons in the city, but more importantly, I actually wanted to be with my future husband. So we were in the SUNY system, the State University of New York system. And so we both transferred up to Buffalo and was in the art department, got into the art department up there. And I started painting. And the professors there were the opposite of the professors I had had in the community college. In the community college, I had had real artists, professional artists, that many of them were coming up from the city in New York. But at Buffalo, it just wasn't, it just didn't click. The experience didn't click. I was very discouraged. I kind of lost my mojo. And when I was still living at home that year, was teaching in a school, and I met a woman who was a puppeteer. With her, we drove that summer. We drove into New York City to study puppetry under Bill Baird, who was still very much had a theater and was a famous puppeteer. And I fell in love with the art of puppetry. And so even before my husband and I headed up to Buffalo, he built a puppet stage in his basement. And we rented a van and we brought up all our stuff to Buffalo. And before the year was out, all right, that was our junior year in college. Before the year was out, by that September, we had gotten married and we'd also started performing puppet shows. We were hired by a group to perform at a craft fair. They offered to give us a booth to sell puppets because our $25 fee was a little too expensive for them. And then I started making puppets for sale in addition to performing with puppets. And the truth be told, my husband and I did the puppet shows in the Buffalo area for about 4 years. But the truth be told, he was the much better performer and actor and I was not. And I really just liked making them. And so from there, I was invited to do craft shows and exhibit my puppets and what became also my dolls and soft sculpture. And so I sort of embarked upon this 10-year career as a fiber artist doing figurative soft sculpture until I became an illustrator.
That's really interesting. So if I understand you right, you were going to school for traditional art, and then you found your love and passion for puppetry. And that's
right.
called fiber art. I've never really heard of that.
Well, fiber art, because in the 70s, in the crafts world, you were a metal artist, or you were a jeweler, or you were a glass artist, or you were a fiber artist. And the fiber artists encompassed, weaving and quilting and sewing. And so I worked in cloth. And so I was a fiber artist. And I also, I started to employ surface decoration techniques of stamping and dyeing and printing and things like that as well. But it was sort of like a haven from my rough experience getting my BFA at the college. Just that left me, except for my very last semester when I was doing printmaking and loving it, that experience left me with a very bad taste in my mouth for so-called fine art. And so working in the field of crafts, it was like a haven, a respite from all of that. And I enjoyed it. And it sort of took away the sting of having felt like I somehow just didn't succeed as a painter. And I found great pleasure in it. And plus, and you have to understand it, at that time in the craft world, it was just a total wonderful booming time. And began to do a fair called the Rhinebeck, the ACC, American Craft Council Fair in Rhinebeck, which was about 40 miles north of New York City. And I would do that fair, and I would take orders, and I would connect with craft galleries. And it was very, very fulfilling. And, as the opposite of dealing with cranky professors, it was, I couldn't make my work fast enough. I would sell. Suddenly people were buying my dolls, my soft sculptures, and I would take orders, and it was very satisfying, and I enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I enjoyed that whole world, and I enjoyed the pleasure of making what I wanted to make, and then the audience found me, if that makes sense.
No, that's so interesting that the goal of artists is to create something that they love, and with their creativity and their vision, and people appreciate it. And so your professors may have been wrong in that, they may have been harsh to you, but you've done what an artist needs to do is be successful. How did you find your transition back to 2D art, like painting? Like, how did that even start?
Well, when we moved, we were in upstate New York for 9 years, and my husband took a job in Boston. And so we moved to the Boston area. I had assistants helping me, working for me when I was in Ithaca. We were in Ithaca, and I didn't have anybody. And there became an urge to just draw again. And what happened was I was teaching a course in doing what I was doing, the doll making, and I got to take a free course. And so I took a graphic design course, which was language I totally didn't understand about getting something into print. And so as a result, I said, I really want to be an illustrator. And I spent a year just drawing and researching illustration and trying to understand how you get something into print. And of course, we're talking back then, it's totally different than it is now. But I began to love that. And so it took me, I think, about 6 months. And I started going around, about 6 months to a year. And I started going around with my portfolio. And if we took trips, I would also bring the portfolio with me. So in the very beginning, I also had this in the back of my head. I wanted to do children's books as well. And I went to the children's book publishers, and they said, "Oh, I really like your stuff, but it's a little edgy. Have you been to the editorial in newspapers and magazines?" And I went to the newspapers and magazines, and they said, "Oh, love this stuff. Have you been to the children's book publishers?" and so ultimately, my first job as an illustrator was from Boston Magazine, and it was a little black and white ink drawing for a monthly column that they had. And that started me. That was around 1982, and that started me on my path. Then we took a trip to Florida, and I had started doing some more color illustration, and I decided on a lark. I brought my portfolio down to the Fort Lauderdale News, Sun Sentinel. I also met with the editorial staff at the Miami Herald. They had a magazine then called Tropic Magazine. And I met with their art director. I think Dave Barry actually was still there at the time. We were there on a vacation, and they gave me an assignment before we left. So I actually had to started some sketching while we were down in Florida. I was doing a portrait of Jackie Gleason, and showed them the rough, and then went home and finished it, and then mailed it back to them and shipped it back. And then I was kind of off and running. And, we took a trip around the country, and I brought my portfolio, and I got work in Chicago Magazine and Chicago Times Magazine. And somebody there must have been an art director and went to Detroit, and I got work from the Detroit Free Press. So it kind of snowballed. I remember saying to myself, man, I can't believe somebody actually pays me to sit and draw and paint. It was hard. And eventually, of course, then it was, I can't believe I'm only getting paid this to sit and draw and paint. So
it's so interesting because things are done so different today, right?
I know.
With
there
technology.
were no websites.
Yeah, and you could do that. Story you just gave there was so interesting because it gives insight on how it was back in the day. That was interesting. So in the past, it was literally you had a portfolio, and how did you get connected to people? Did you just cold call them? Because there was no email.
Nope. You'd look up and there wasn't even the internet, so you couldn't go online and try to find out who's the art director at the Miami Herald. I don't even remember how I discovered it. And you just found out, or maybe what you'd do, you'd get a copy of the magazine, or you'd find out who the art director was, and you'd call and you'd make an appointment. You literally would pound the pavement, and you'd carry a leather portfolio around with you that had you didn't carry real artwork. I had prints of my artwork made, like chrome prints of it, but you'd carry examples of your work around with you, and you'd open up your book, and they would or later on, when I started to enter children's publishing, you'd leave your book for the day and then come back and retrieve it. But initially, it was nice because I met with people in person, and you were a little bit of a salesman. You were hustling. I kind of liked it. So.
And you got to have thick skin because it wasn't like you can shoot your portfolio on an email and not get the critique right there. You can get a critique face to face, whether it was good or bad.
Right. That's right. After being in college, you have to, in this business, if you're an artist, you have to get a thick skin or, just give up. And so it was, I don't know, I can't explain how I did it, but I did. And I just sorted out. I kind of had chutzpah, I guess, I had nerve to just do it.
So, I know. Sometimes you look back at yourself and you're like, wow, that was a lot of fire. I can't believe I did that.
I know. I know. But I did. And so then what happened was my work, we became parents. And in fact, the trip around the country, we traveled with our newly adopted oldest son when he was about 15 months old, and took a train around the country because I hated to get on an airplane. I know, that's silly. But anyway, so we stopped in Chicago, and we stopped in Seattle, and we stopped, and that's how my book got to those places. And then we had a second son and a third son, and my work, I had a very edgy look to my work, and my work started to get softer. And I would say that the one thing that made a big difference in my career as an illustrator, now this is before websites, was I took out advertisements in what they call source books. So I took out an ad in the Graphic Artists Guild Directory of Illustration. I would say that one more than the others, like Black Book or Workbook. And these, I don't know if listeners are familiar with those, but you put your work in these books and then you pay for the pages, and the books get sent around the country to art directors.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. And that I just started getting calls. And because my work was losing its edge, I started getting calls from children's publishers. I started doing a lot of educational work. And now this, out of the blue, an old illustrator friend called me and said, "Oh, Barbara, I saw your recent ad in such and such book." I don't remember which it was. And she goes, "Yeah, I don't like them." So, and during that conversation, she said, "Do you know so-and-so?" And she has a children's book critique group you might want to go to. And so I just, on a lark, I called her up and I met with her. And that's how I connected with the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And I started going to those conferences. And once I did that, I was really abandoning editorial illustration, which coincidentally was dying anyway. And I was really just focused on children's books. And so after those, it was the last time I had taken my portfolio around had been maybe 10 years earlier. And I hopped on a train with my husband, took a couple of days to New York, and started bringing my portfolio around again because I didn't have a website yet. And a few months later, I got my first trade book assignment. So, and then that's how I started doing children's books. So,
I was going to say, I feel like your art promotes creativity and happiness, your particular style. And that's why, I think magazines and book illustrations are so drawn to your style. I think you answered this, but did you consciously decide to make your work look this magnetic to target children's books, or that just happened? Sounds like it happened organically.
It just sort of happened. And, I had a literary agent for a while. And at one point she goes, "I love your art." She goes, "And it still has an edge." So I guess I didn't get too cutesy. I still had a slight edge to my children's book illustration that made it maybe a little different. Eventually, some famous, well-known illustrators like Lane Smith, who were super edgy, but when I was trying to do it maybe 10 years earlier, that much edge wasn't in. So, but it's just, I think that you work the way you work, and I just drew the way I drew, and I painted the way I painted, and that's, you have a certain, people tell me that they can see the thread in my work from my early work to my current work. I don't see it as much, but I think it's like you have your own handwriting and you have your way of thinking and drawing and painting. And if you do it enough, you just can't deny it. It comes through. So.
And for the listeners, I'd like for you guys to jump to her Instagram page, because my favorite piece of yours is this Frida Kahlo 3D cutout art piece with Diego Rivera in the middle of her forehead. Some of this won't make sense until you actually see it. Please tell us how you choose who or what you paint.
Well, when I left behind publishing industry, which was in about 2017, I was sort of easing out of it, but I think I made a conscious decision that said, I'm done. I really just want to paint what I want to paint, and I'm leaving that behind. Plus, my kids were grown, so I sort of was losing interest in children's books besides. I haven't sought out the gallery representation yet, per se. So the way I got my work seen is that I seek out juried exhibition opportunities. And so I had to, like all over again, I had to research, well, how do you find shows to apply to? And then there are vehicles like Cafe and others, and you find them. And so I saw that the Bedford Gallery in Walnut Creek, California, was having a show, Frida-themed show. And so I specifically came up with the two pieces that I did to apply to that show. And the one that they chose was the head, the one where I just did her eyes and portrait of Diego and her forehead, which is more of an assemblage kind of piece. But that's how I ended up doing Frida. And I've since done a third painting of Frida as well. And that's also how I I will create. It's almost like I'm an illustrator again. I seek an opportunity. And if the show has a theme, I might create something in keeping with that theme to apply to jury. And so and there's a deadline, and it's like, oh, it's illustration all over again. Except with illustration, I would frequently have 2 weeks to get a full editorial illustration in. So.
Yeah, you're answering some of the questions I was going to ask later on in the podcast, but one of those questions was, how are you going to build your personal brand? And it sounds like that's some of your strategy right there, but is there any other things that you're trying to do to have more people see your work?
Well, Instagram, I think, is really been key for me. It's how I connected with you. I've had I guess sometimes invitation from galleries for some specific shows. It's just a nice way to put you out there. You work out there. I don't have formal gallery representation. I participated in some galleries for their shows, but there's not one place I can say, well, you can find my work and such. That is something I haven't done yet. I haven't, pounded the pavements, figuratively speaking, with a portfolio to look for the gallery yet. And I realized also that my brand, no matter whether I was doing dolls or illustrations or doing children's books, is that I'm essentially a storyteller, and I'm a figurative creator, and it's more or less, my work is more or less about portraits and capturing the essence of what that character is all about. And so I guess you could say that I've discovered is my brand. That's all. I'm really mostly just interested in painting figures or people or characters. And I guess that's the brand. I've decided that's what I do. I'm going to stick to it.
For the people who are fans of your work, can they personally buy a piece from you, or are your pieces for sale in that way, or are they not?
Well, I do. I do put them on my website with the prices, or if a piece is at a gallery show, then they can buy it through the gallery. I haven't really figured out how to do a commercial, like a shopping cart sort of thing. And it hasn't been I've sold pieces, but it's not yet where I'm focused. Mostly people that have bought them have kind of sought me out. So I haven't really given a lot of thought to how I was going to market, except just to get the work seen. I like it when a piece does sell. I like it, send it off to a show and the piece sells, and that's a good feeling. I figured I really should think more about that. But right now, I just feel compelled to just make the art. I can't explain it.
I gotcha. And I'm looking at your paintings here and your illustrations. You do capture some essence of that subject. Please tell me your process before you even start. Is there a lot of strategy before you start, or you just put paintbrush to canvas and it just happens?
Oh, no, I'm still very much the planner. I start with sketching. I even did that when I was a doll maker. I would sketch out concepts and ideas, and I will sit with a sketchbook and a number 2 pencil, and I will just free flow draw. And usually I'm listening to something like a podcast, like your podcast, or an audiobook, or even junk television, because I don't like to think too much when I'm first generating ideas. I like to do it intuitively. And so for me to do it intuitively, I need to put my mind someplace else. So I'm sort of just kind of painting from my heart instead of my head, or drawing from my heart instead of my head. Gotcha. And then I'll take those sketches, and sometimes I'll look through them, and frequently they evolve into a painting. So. Gotcha.
I'm looking through here, and I love, how did you come up with this concept of using 3D, I don't even know how to explain it. I'm looking at another Frida and Diego piece here where Diego's in black and white, but it's in this frame. How did that come to fruition?
Well, I'm thinking of that particular frame. I think my husband made the frame for me, and we added the piece on the top. Does that one have a piece on the top? I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, it does.
And yeah.
It has a half circle.
Yeah, and I like the idea. I was inspired by a friend of mine, Rich Dunbrock, who did an installation in our kitchen about 8 years ago. And he inspired, I gave him a couple of wooden panels at one point. And I said, hey, Rich, I'd started a painting that was on more than one piece. And I said, can you figure out a way for me to attach these two together? And he did. And he came back with this remarkable piece that was half sculpture, half painting. And so then I started working with that. Initially, I had him create some pieces for me to work on. And then I started making them myself. And so sometimes, I like to use the homemade frames. I just don't, as opposed to having a piece frame, just, doing it myself. And I like adding things to the top or other addition, details and three-dimensional pieces. I'm working on a fun piece now that's just beginning, and it's using something that I found on eBay about 10 years ago. And I thought, I'm going to use that at some point in a piece of artwork. And so now I'm going to do it, and I'm creating the piece expressly to use this particular found object that I have. So I like combining, and I think combining the materials and playing with the, 3D and 2D, it goes back a lot to when I was a doll maker, because towards the end of doll making, I was painting on the fabric in addition to sewing and creating the 3D figures. And it was just like, when you love to draw and paint, you can't suppress it. And so I was doing that more and more and more, and playing with the surface and paint on the surface, embroider on top of the painting, add things, details onto it. So in a way, doing the paintings and then combining objects, found objects, small details and bit of salvage is unlike when I was sewing, if you understand what I mean.
I just love that particular style. I don't know if that's just a popular thing or you created that, but I love that when you combine your paintings with like a frame and becomes this 3D interactive like art. Let me ask you another question. Out of all your wonderful paintings, is there one here particular or two or three that you're just you love the most out of all of them?
Well, one of my very favorites was my tattooed Frida. I just can't. Well, what I do is when I'm doing a specific person, I will sketch out my ideas first roughly, but then I really need to know what that person looks like. And so I was reading everything under the sun and learning about Frida and all her life and her struggles and things. So that piece is one of my very favorite pieces. And, she had many lovers. And so I tattooed her lovers on her. And that piece I sold. It was a little hard to part with because it was one of my favorites, but that's one. I think, then the other one of Frida, he who sees the color, she who wears the color, he who sees. I like that one as well. And then there's a few others, more recent pieces that I like. I just finished one. I don't know if you're familiar with the character of Walter Mercado.
No.
There's a great Netflix documentary on him. I had never heard of him before. And I guess he was a famous astrologer from Puerto Rico. And he had a TV show that was broadcast in the States as well. And I just was so inspired by that character. So I just finished a piece of his about him yesterday. And I'm looking at it and I'm really liking it.
Is that on Instagram?
Not yet. The painting in progress is on Instagram, but the framed piece, I haven't posted it yet. And that has an assemblage frame using lots of goodies and even croquet sticks. So that'll be on shortly. I haven't put that one on yet.
I'm gonna look forward to that.
Yeah, that's so. You know what? My last piece is usually my favorite piece. So
let me ask you this question: you've had such a illustrious, long career. You've done a lot of different things. Out of all the things you've accomplished, what are you most proud of?
Well, aside from, it sounds so cliche, so corny, but aside from, raising my children and having my family, I think the things I'm working on now, because, publishing, we talk about egos and and struggling with it. Publishing really can do a number on your ego. And so that was a struggle. So I was proud to become an author as well as an illustrator. That's not easy. It's everybody and their uncle would like to write and illustrate children's books. So I was sort of proud of that. But I'm prouder now of what I'm doing, I think, artistically speaking. I feel like I'm just kind of creating from my heart again. Like when I was doing the dolls, I'm doing what I want to do, and I don't have to follow any direction, and I don't have to meet any requirements. And I think what I'm working on now is finding myself and working on in this regard.
Now, that's an awesome thing because you don't have to negotiate with art directors or clients. You completely have complete, total freedom, and your imagination is boundless, and you can do whatever you like. And
you have to go where the spirit takes you.
Absolutely. And do you have any advice for young artists that like to follow your footsteps?
I would say the first thing I would tell anybody is that keep a sketchbook and sketch all the time, and just record ideas and visual ideas, and keep track of it, and don't have expectations from your sketches. Just see what happens, because ideas will flow out of it. So I would say that to begin with. I would say keep trying. It hasn't been easy. Every time I switched venues, from when I went from being a soft sculpture artist to being an illustrator, it was tough because I was used to getting a lot of praise and success as a soft sculpture artist. And then I'm trying to become an illustrator, and I had to start from scratch, but I kept going. And the same thing when I went into children's publishing, I just kept going, especially, let me tell you, publishing, you get a very thick skin from publishing. Rejections all the time. You get almost to the verge of they're going to buy a manuscript, and then it gets pulled off and they decline. So that toughened my skin, so much so that now if I'm applying to a juried show and I don't get in, it's like, kind of been there, done that. It's that's their loss kind of thing, and you move on. So I would just say keep going, develop a tough skin, but believe in yourself. You have to believe that you have something to say. Artists have to believe, and they have to draw enough and keep working enough to find their own language, their own sensibility. That's key.
No, that's great advice. And I guess it's amazing that you said something about, just don't have a lot of expectations on your sketchbook. That's something that you need to explore and practice. And I have a problem with that. Like, I'm such a perfectionist. I'm always expecting my sketchbooks to look perfect, and that's not what it's designed to do, right? So great advice there for young artists. I want to ask you this last question, and we can get into some fun questions to know you better. But you've mentioned about, obviously illustrating a children's book, but you also said you were an author. And I know processes change, but during the time you were doing that, what was that like? So when you authored a book and illustrated a book, the sales become part of you make money out of the sales of the book?
In children's publishing, you're either the author or you're the illustrator or you're the author illustrator. And so I've illustrated a lot of books that I haven't authored. And unfortunately, I've made much more money from those books than I have the ones where I authored and illustrated my own books. I did a series for a very famous author by the name of David Adler, and I still get royalty checks from that. So it's kind of nice. The work is done. Royalty checks are like manna from heaven. You've done the work. You've had the stress. You met the deadline, and all of a sudden, the quarterly, and they'll send you a check. It's kind of nice. I did make some royalty check payments from my own books. I wrote and illustrated 3 of them. So what it is first comes the manuscript, and then if you sell the manuscript, and if you're also the illustrator, then you do the book dummy, where you dummy it up page by page, and how it's going to spread, how the words are going to break, how the pagination is going to go, and where the art's going to go, and where the text is going to go. And you work back and forth with the publisher, with the editor, the art editor, or the art director, whoever is at the publisher. And then it goes to print eventually. So it's a long process. It's stressful. I would say that it's of all the media that I've worked in, that children's publishing was the most stressful. Even working when I was doing editorial illustrations and I had to turn things around very, very quickly, children's publishing is much more stressful. So, I'm glad I did it. I'm proud that I achieved it, but I'm happy to move on. So.
No, awesome. Thank you. That's really insightful. I'd like to shoot you some fun questions to get to know you better as an artist.
Okay.
So the first question is, when you need inspiration, where do you get it?
I would say that I have a giant library of art books and of all kinds of artists and of photographs and of junk, because I'm also a collector and a part-time antique dealer, if you can believe it. And so I like looking at that stuff. And I love especially looking at photographs because it kind of gets my wheels turning, like the Vivian Maier books, with all that photographer that was discovered quite by accident. I have a bunch of, I just find just looking at her photographs inspiring. Diane Arbus kind of photographs. I love looking at old photos like that. So that's what's one place I get it. As I said, I just got inspired by a Netflix documentary about Walter Mercado. So that was another place.
I'm definitely going to check that Netflix documentary out. And
yeah, it's called Mucho Mucho Amor. So.
Awesome. That's a great title. What's your favorite museum? And it can be an art museum. It can be any museum that you have visited.
I think I like the Whitney because it's more contemporary, and I like the Museum of Modern Art. I've been, not too long ago, I actually was at the Met to see the Hockney show because I love Hockney. And then I would say that I got to see her, I think it was that same trip to New York. One of my personal favorite artists is Red Grooms, and the Marlborough had a show of his work, and he knocks my socks off. And so, that's been a treat for me.
Is there anything you want to accomplish that you haven't accomplished yet?
I want, at some point, I think I'll seek out like permanent kind of gallery representation, I suppose. I just want to keep creating, making the kinds of paintings that I want to do, and I want to find the venues to share them. Every artist, I suppose, has a fantasy, and somewhere, but I don't want to, have a crazy fantasy like a museum show or that kind of thing. I'm just happy to keep working. I think what I need to do is, for me, I know my audience out there, and I need to be able to find more of them, to figure out how to tap into that market. I'm able to sell my work. I just have to get it in front of the right people. So I guess that's my goal, is just to continue to work, stay healthy, and continue to work.
Finally, Barbara, how do you define success, or what do you want your legacy to be?
Well, every time I paint something, I think to myself, well, this will surely outlive me, which is sort of why I ended up going into books as opposed to magazine illustration, because, with a magazine illustration, it's great. It's artistically very satisfying. But, even if it's a Sunday magazine on Monday, it's in the trash on Monday. Then when I held my first book in my hand, I thought, oh, well, this is something lasting. This will be around when I'm no longer around. So whenever I paint something, I like to imagine who eventually, as a collector as well as an artist, where will this eventually end up? And I guess I'd like somehow my legacy to be that she painted portraits and she was a storyteller, and she kept working till she couldn't move anymore. So she kept going, she kept creating.
No, that's great. And that's a great perspective. I didn't think about that in terms of books. You're right. That will always be something that you can pass it down to somebody else. And it has your fingerprint and your vision. And that's something I didn't think about. That's interesting. Barbara, I definitely want to thank you for sharing us your awesome creative journey. Where can people connect with you or see your work again?
I think the best place really right now is Instagram. It's just Johansen Newman. My website, johansennewman.com. And Facebook, I have a Johansen Newman Facebook page. So those are the best places. And when I do have work in a show, like I have a show right now, I will post it on Instagram and tell people how they can go see it. So Instagram is probably my most current thing.
Awesome. And thank you. And listeners, please connect with her, see her fantastic art. And everyone, take care and goodbye.
Thank you, Chris.